Good morning, everyone. I apologize for getting started 15 minutes late. You can blame me. My train was late this morning. That's the truth. Anyway, good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Finance Committee to order, please. It is ahead of our regularly scheduled meeting next Monday on December 10th. This meeting came about a result of last month's November board meeting, when the board thought a special session would be helpful to further review the budget materials that were provided back on November 19th. We appropriately noticed this meeting and has been listed on the website since November 26th. David, are there any public speakers?
We have 6 public speakers, Mr. Chairman. The first speaker will be Christopher Greif, followed by Rachel Faust.
Good morning. My name is Christopher D. Greif. I'm also a member of the Transit Riders Council and advocate for people with disabilities. I'd like to also, number one priority, make sure we do support the Fast Forward program. A lot of advocates really want the Fast Forward to help more accessibility train stations and buses. Also, with the if the fare does go up, we need to make sure that the half-fare Metro card for seniors and disabled stay in a lower price for seniors and disabled, or people who have disability, who have Social Security disability, can know how to budget their budget. It is very hard for them to get, if the fare goes up, it's going to be harder for them, because if they go up, it's going to be hard for them to get their money to go up, as well as food stamps. So if we are going to try to go up, please make sure that on your forms that how much is the half of the fare will cost. So Social Security can know when the fare goes up as well. So communication between state and federal can also get this information out, so the families can be comfortable and relaxed, because we do have some families may know that, but some families maybe don't understand that. That's part of the disability world. I repeat, please support the Fast Forward program. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Rachel Faust, who will be followed by H.P. Schroeder.
Good morning. I'm Rachel Faust, Senior Research Analyst for reInvent Albany. We advocate for more transparent and accountable state government, including for authorities like the MTA. Former Chairman Loda and New York City Transit President Andy Byford have both noted the importance of the MTA becoming a more transparent and accountable institution in order to restore its credibility. This is particularly crucial given the immense financial challenges it faces. While this meeting is an important opportunity for the public to discuss, for the greater public discussion of the MTA's 2019 budget, there's another way for the MTA to instill public confidence: put all of its budget data online in an open format. Currently, the MTA publishes its budget information in PDF file format, which is not readable by spreadsheet software. This means members of the public need to scrape or convert the PDF document into spreadsheet form, or hand type endless columns of numbers. This makes it very hard for the public to check the MTA's math and gain real insights from the MTA budget reports. Data in PDF format is not open government, and it is not meaningful transparency. Back in 2012 and 2014, reInvent Albany and members of the New York City Transparency Working Group asked the MTA in writing to make all tables of financial data provided in the board books available in both PDF and spreadsheet format, as part of further compliance with Governor Cuomo's Executive Order 95 that created the New York State Open Data website. We had at least 3 meetings with MTA leadership, including Bob Ferrand, to discuss making the budget machine readable. We have lauded the MTA for its real-time transit data feeds. However, it has been 6 years since we asked the MTA to truly open its books, and nothing further has happened. We are asking today that the board work with MTA staff to renew the MTA's focus on open data by 1, putting the budget information online in CSV spreadsheet form, and 2, creating an open budget website for the MTA for its capital and expense budgets and other financial information. And just a quick note, the New York State Open Budget website is available in open source format. This was created by Governor Cuomo a couple of years ago, something the MTA should look at in order to facilitate this. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is H.P. Schroeder, my apologies, followed by Lisa Daglian.
Good morning. As many of you know, my name is H.P. Schroeder. I'm a veteran of World War II. I'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to George H.W. Bush for his service for country during the war and throughout his life. But I also would like to pay a special tribute to my favorite fellow Navy aviation radio gunner, Robert C. Wendling. Bob was not as fortunate as the President and myself, because he died off Okinawa, forgive me, while still in his teens. But had he lived, the MTA would have made him wait over 46 years before he would get a discount. And he would get this because of his age, not because he served and sacrificed for our country. My mission, lest you forget, is to correct this injustice by giving all veterans the same discount as seniors. I know you are required to hold public hearings regarding the potential fare increase, and it has to be heart-wrenching not to be moved by the personal stories, anger, and frustration demonstrated at these meetings. Yours is not an easy job, and I commend you for your efforts. My decision to speak before these meetings was not made lightly. For why would I think those who were struggling to put food on the table and fighting a price increase would support my effort for getting a discount by dedicating 2 cents from every fare for a veteran's discount? Why? Because I was transparent. I grant you at my age, my hearing is not that great. But what I heard from the public was they want transparency. I hope you noted their overwhelming and enforced support for a veteran's discount.
Please conclude your remarks, sir.
I will.
Thank you.
In spite of their own struggles to make ends meet, they recognize there is something special about someone who puts their life in danger for country, something this board continues to deny. I thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lisa Daglian, followed by the Honorable Gail Brewer.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Daglian. I'm the Executive Director of the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA. Thank you for holding this special meeting today. Clearly, the MTA is in dire financial straits, and funding must be identified from both within agencies and from outside sources. We understand that a fare hike is likely to help close the gap, and again, we call for the fairest alternative for the regular commuters and riders of the system. At the same time, it's critical that we continue on the path to improving service and that there are no service cuts or cuts that will impact its reliability. Some of the BRP cuts will affect the rider experience, including cuts to station cleaners and track maintenance. We just can't go backwards to the bad old days. Tomorrow, we will be testifying at the City Council in support of Fast Forward and increased city funding. And we may sound like a broken record here, but Amazon must be considered as a viable funding source to improve the transit infrastructure in Long Island City for both New York City Transit and the Long Island Railroad. More people will mean more congestion in stations that are sorely in need of repair, upgrades, and accessibility. And as we will hear shortly, fare beating is also costing the system substantially and puts additional pressure on fares and service, which hurts all New Yorkers. And finally, similar to comments made by reInvent Albany and the previous speaker, we are suggesting that the MTA form a transparency working group that would work with MTA staff, and we're happy to offer our services to create a navigable online data and information resource for riders and others to be able to understand how funding comes in, how it's allocated, how it's spent, and where budget holes may be. This is particularly important as we have a whole host of new freshman legislators coming into the state that need to be able to access this information. And giving all New Yorkers access to this information will support education and advocacy efforts. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the Honorable Gail Brewer, followed by Omar Vera.
Gail Brewer.
Good morning. My name is Paul Goebel, and I'm the transportation analyst for Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer. I'll be delivering testimony for the Borough President today. Thank you, Chair Schwartz and members of the Finance Committee for holding this additional meeting to discuss the upcoming budget amendments detailed in the MTA's November financial plan. I'm here today to discuss one issue in particular, and that's the MTA's deferral of the M96 upgrade to select bus service. As you know, under the Mayor's Bus Forward plan, the MTA and City DOT were set to upgrade the M96 to SBS next year. However, included in these budget amendments documents is an amendment to defer the upgrade until 2021 at the earliest, and possibly as late as 2023. The MTA's stated reasons for SBS deferral have been budget savings and the planned borough-wide bus redesigns. However, as I've previously stated, these reasons just don't apply to the M96. The route, one of the shortest in the city, is incredibly inexpensive to upgrade at a cost of just $1.8 million additional dollars. And the M96 route will not meaningfully change following Manhattan's bus route redesign. Simply put, there's no reason to wait. A couple of weeks ago, the MTA and DOT briefed Community Boards 7 and 8 on the positive benefits of the M79's upgrade to SBS just over a year ago. What we've seen is fantastic. Travel times have decreased by 8%, the time buses idled at stops was reduced by 21%, and most importantly, ridership improved by 9%, even though it had been dropping prior to SBS implementation. As ridership decreases have been a problem for the MTA's finances, this should be of keen interest to us all. The M96 route and its 14,000 daily riders deserve to benefit from the same tremendous improvements SBS has delivered for the M79. And it should be noted that the M96 route has lost ridership every year since 2013. Just before Thanksgiving, my office wrote a letter to President Byford and Acting Chairman Ferrer requesting that they reverse this decision. And as you know, I reiterated that request at the MTA fare increase hearings. Today, I am once again issuing the same request to reverse the referral of the M96 upgrade to SBS and instead resume implementation. At last month's MTA Board meeting, DOT Commissioner Trottenberg stated that riders are hungry for the kinds of improvements that come with SBS, and I couldn't agree more. The M96 represents the exact kind of low-cost but high-reward bus route the MTA should prioritize. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker today is Omar Vera.
Good morning, MTA Board, Finance Committee. Welcome to the special edition of a special Finance Committee meeting. And today we got to discuss a couple things, most notably the fares. Now this it's my opinion that this and the opinion of many that this 2%, like this biannual fare toll changes, can't keep on going forever. We need to somehow make it stable and at least make it at least half a decade or more before we do this. Because I remember the last time, as far as I can remember regarding these fares, it used to be $150 growing up until I was like about 10 or 11 when the fare changed in May of 2003 to $2. And that was fine all the way up until 2009 when he changed it to $225 and so on and so forth. But like I said, this fare thing needs to be stabilized. It cannot keep going up or changing every 2 years. It's just it's impractical. And I also want to support my what HP Shorter says. Please introduce a veterans discount. They've served our country long enough. They need the benefits of discounts. I'm with you, man. And this is another thing. We have to make sure that the fares best serve the needs of everybody, not just those. And definitely, we don't want any more fare beaters in the system. We know who supports fare beaters, and they are wrong. They are wrong. We're not going to mention them. And of course, please ally yourselves with the new incoming all-Democratic government in Albany, especially the new senator-elect of my district, the Honorable Robert Jackson. Ally yourselves with him. He can get things done, and he'll support you back. With that said, I shall be here next Monday as well as the public hearing in Brooklyn to discuss more. Thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the public speaking section.
Thank you, David. The minutes of the November 13th Finance Committee meeting will be presented at our next meeting, Monday the 10th. I'd like to now turn over the presentation of Bob Foran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are happy to take any questions about anything relating to the budget today, but what we wanted to focus on is an issue that had been raised by many of the members of the committee, and that's the budget reduction program and what are the items in that budget reduction program. I'd start by pointing out that we have to achieve significant cost reductions. We had $264 million of additional cost reductions we were trying to hit this year, 539 next year, 518 the year following, and basically 500 plus million through 2022. We did not hit those recurring cost savings this year, and we're not going to hit them next year. We're going to try to fill the gap with one-shot reductions by delaying projects. The biggest challenge was presented to New York City Transit. The other agencies were able to hit their recurring cost savings. Transit, with the largest targets, didn't hit them, so we're closing them with one-shots. But the cost reductions that they are presenting at each of the agencies are not easy to achieve, and they're not without some pain. They're tough decisions, and we asked the agency presidents and their staff to do the best that they could to come up with what they thought could be the least impactful cuts. So these cuts are not ones that they're willingly, happily embracing. These are difficult cuts. Each of the presidents is here today to go through some material that you have in front of you. This is material that was in Volume 2, where we laid out each individual savings initiative. We just combined them here for your ease. There are savings initiatives that were first put into the July plan. Some of those have been removed, others remain, and then there are savings initiatives from the November plan. We've asked each of the presidents to go through and give you a very quick, high-level summary of what they've done, point out some of the things that they would like to point out, and then open it up to go through the individual items that you may have questions about, and their staff is here to respond. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Andy Byford to talk about New York City Transit.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Bob. Thank you for that introduction. I mean, I'd just like to begin by echoing what Bob said, namely that this has not been an easy exercise. I mean, we recognize, obviously, for transit, we have the biggest budget, so therefore we are required to find the biggest savings. But in terms of the actual quantum, the original target for New York City Transit for 2019 was $220 million, of which we found 129. And 2020 was $203 million, of which we found 121.5 million. And these are not easy things to find, particularly when that corresponds with or coincides with what we're really trying to do, which is drive up service. So we're trying to improve all aspects of our service by focusing on things that matter to customers, by providing literally better service in terms of reliability, in terms of punctuality, in terms of customer service, in terms of cleanliness. So these are not easy choices. And it's not as though, contrary to what some might think, we have swathes of waste or swathes of administrative overhead or discretionary spend from which we can cut. Having said that, you'll see within the plan before you, within the document before you, which is 5 pages long for NYCT, that there are still further administrative reductions that we've made. We've tightened up on things like hiring restrictions. That's an ongoing process. We've reduced wellness programs. I'm on page 1. We have identified in some cases, we found we were overpaying for DEP water, so that's something that we tightened up on. There's been some changes to things like mandated training. So we have looked, before we even countenanced going to customer affecting service, we've looked at every possible way that we can claw in and tighten up and be even more thrifty in terms of how we run the operation. And that's certainly a theme going through the 5 pages. You'll see that there's a number of efficiencies where we believe that with some tightening up of what we do, we can reduce cost without overly impacting service, where it's more what you might call behind the scenes activity. Having said that, given the quantum that we were required to find, there are things that will be service affecting nonetheless. And what we aimed to do was to limit the impact of those initiatives. And in particular, we came up with 3 scenarios for potential different bands of savings. And the only scenario that's included within this documentation and within these figures are the level 1 savings, which are the least impactful upon customers. Had we been required to go further, we identified what you might call medium impact and severe impact. And I'm very pleased to say that we've managed to avoid that. And I appreciate, Bob, your efforts in terms of the one-shots that precluded us having to do that, because they would, to use my words, have been draconian. And we really don't want to go there. So let me just highlight a few things, and I'll do it by page. I'm on page 1. In addition to the administrative reductions and efficiencies that we found, the first one in the grey box, and the grey box relates to things that we've either delayed or later on you'll see there's 2 on the very back page that we're now not going to do, but the first 4 pages, grey box means a delay. This first one, which is the elimination of police fare evasion overtime, may seem counterintuitive in the context of what we'll be talking about later on, namely fare evasion. But the reason for this and the rationale for this, and actually the reason we're deferring it, is because we have been paying NYPD $4 million annually for extra fare abuse patrols in the subway. Having said that, because the policy changed and they've been making fewer arrests, when a police officer arrests someone for fare evasion, that it takes them out of the system so that they have to go back to the precinct in order to book the individual. So then typically you incur overtime as you get someone else who comes in to provide the coverage. Well, the number of arrests, as we'll see later on in the fare evasion presentation that we're going to give, has dropped right away. So we think that this, albeit deferred, can be done. But I'd stress, is something that we can go back to and have another look at in the context of the fare evasion discussion that we're going to have. At the bottom of page 1, there are 2 items I'd like to draw your attention to. One, which relates to track inspections. That's where we propose to automate one of the 2 weekly track inspections using what's called the track geometry car to perform video track inspection. It's a very efficient way of inspecting track. It's a very sophisticated piece of equipment. It picks up track defects, it plots where they are, and it then flags to the maintainers where they need to go out and take action. It also has the benefit, and I can't stress this enough, that it does mean fewer people on the track, which is, of course, the most risky place to be on any railway, because you're in proximity to moving trains and you're in proximity to live electricity. The second is the one at the bottom, the terminal car cleaning reduction. This does not mean that we will not clean cars at termini, but it will mean that we will only on some lines clean them at one end. So where at the moment they're cleaned on both ends of a journey, they will be cleaned at just one end. And that's something we'll keep under very close review, because what I don't want is to see a material degradation in the cleanliness of trains. I'll turn to page 2. I'm not going to read all of them out, but I will cover a couple of them. You may be, again, surprised to see one relating to Eagle Team efficiencies, the Eagle Team being the special teams that we have who board SBS routes typically to check that people have paid their fare. We believe that by changing their assignment from dedicated SBS routes to a borough-based geographic coverage, we can actually provide more coverage. So we'll actually end up with more teams, but with slightly fewer people, because the teams themselves will be, there won't be such big teams, but there'll be more of them. And you'll hear when we get onto the fare evasion presentation, we're actually expanding Eagle Team's scrutiny to regular routes as well. So I think that's a good thing, because that shows that we're equally focused on regular routes for fare evasion. Most of the rest of these on here are, and I won't say non-contentious, but more administrative in nature. We are delaying the auxiliary booth closures to 2020 from 2019. Again, really, to be frank, in the hopes that we do get income to avoid revenue stream, to avoid having to do that. I'd rather not. On page 3 of 5, there's a couple of line items, and the first one is the third one, which is labour efficiencies within Department of Subways. There's a couple of cases where we have chosen to take an unspecified saving. In other words, we're not being specific at this point about what the amount will be, but we're signing up to the figure. But we will need to do the work to make sure that we deliver against that figure, but we just simply haven't had the time to do that. On page 4, There is again an unspecified under Department of Subways material savings, and also on station efficiencies, which is effectively the efficiencies will accrue via the new group station manager program, but there are unspecified savings to come out of that. And then at the bottom there, these are the most service impacting changes. There are two forms of these. These are the level 1 savings that I referred to earlier. There are $30 million worth of bus savings and $10 million worth of subway savings that will begin in 2020, and they are achieved by tightening the service guidelines. The service guidelines being our set standards for levels of crowding. We've identified certain routes on the buses and the subways where with a little more crowding, we still won't breach the crowding level, but we would be able to tighten up the actual service provision such that we can make the savings that are listed. Again, not something we particularly want to do. It's kind of counterintuitive to me, but it's something that we felt that we ought to do, we had to do in order to meet the onerous targets with which we were presented. And then on the final page, those are the two items that you can see that are not now going to happen, and they were the Washington Heights elevator staffing reductions and the reduction in the mobile sales program, which are the mobile vans. Those are the highlights, Mr. Chairman and Bob. I will now happily answer questions with my team.
Let me ask the members of the Finance Committee, would you prefer, as we take each section, that everyone gets a chance to ask questions and then we'll go on to the next area, or you want to go through the whole presentation and then be able to ask questions in it? And just to try to move, I'm just getting people's input before I.
Maybe the whole thing, and then we'll sort of have a holistic sense of what to ask questions about.
All right. Hello. All right, so I'll use Chairman's prerogative here, and just we'll go agency by agency here. This way people, and of course, people can come back after they hear all the presentations, and maybe they'll have new questions, but since it's, Commissioner Albert first.
Thanks, Andy, for your presentation. I actually have three separate questions on things that you've mentioned. On the terminal cleaning staff issue, are you going to determine which lines have cleaning at both ends by length of line, by number of riders per line, by conditions on each line? How will that determination be made?
Commissioner, it's a factor of all of those elements. We're certainly going to use some science behind it. I mean, a classic example being the E line, which suffers particularly from homeless people using the service as a means to sleep, and that does tend to lead to unsanitary conditions. So that would certainly not be on my list. We will apply some science behind making sure that we make those reductions in the least impactful areas.
Okay, thanks. On the issue of the Eagle team becoming borough-wide, does that mean their assignments will be less predictable to the riding public?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole point of a deterrent is it should not be predictable. Yeah. So we want to, in all of the interventions we make to mitigate against fare evasion, not just on SBS routes, but increasingly now RBS, the regular bus service. And as you'll hear in my presentation, we have plans for the subway as well. There needs to be an unpredictable rolling program of interventions, and you don't know when you're going to get checked, where you're going to get checked. So that typically that might not put off the hardline recidivist who just doesn't care and is going to evade the fare every time. What you're trying to do is deter the chancers, the people who think, well, chances are I won't get checked. No, actually, chances are you will. So you might think twice.
All right, thanks. And on the issue of the service guidelines, from the description, it looks like if ridership drops on a particular bus line, that line will be subject to the service guidelines that have not been put into effect yet. Yet if ridership swells on a particular line, those guidelines will not be used to provide extra service. Did I read that incorrectly, or?
No, the guidelines are meant to be dynamic. So if we need to add more service, we do. If we find that a route has declining ridership, then that might be a candidate for a tightening up of the service provided. But I've said it before publicly, and I know you agree with this. I do understand the death spiral that some people describe. That you've got to watch that you don't end up causing the problem yourself by degrading the service, so fewer people riding, so you go, oh, that one doesn't need so much service, you degrade it further, and so you continue.
Yes.
We are very mindful of that phenomenon, and we're trying to avoid that. But, at the end of the day, this was a very, very tough exercise, so we tried to deliver a package that didn't impact customers at all. I think we've been pretty successful in minimizing that. I'm just very grateful we didn't have to go to those level 2 and level 3 doomsday scenarios.
Thank you.
Commissioner Merdler.
Mr. Chairman, I think the issue here really is one as between service reductions that provide not for a way forward, but a way backward to 2008, as compared with non-service savings that can be made. I will show you in a moment how over $100 million or more each year can be made without one single service reduction. The Eagle team, it's useless. As you will hear from the report, as I understand it will be given, the incidents of fare evasion have risen astronomically since the Vance edict. And I will tell you that the single largest item that the public complained about, other than fare increases in the Bronx, was fare evasion. The public, the riding public, said fare evasion was a disaster. It is. And there is an answer to that. The New York City Police Department, through its Transit Bureau, now does a fabulous job in the subways. They should do the same job in the buses. We need to have them function there. You do not, as proposed, reduce cops, you increase them. And if we have to pay for them, it's the best investment we could possibly make. Number two, you want to reduce cleaning at terminals. Do you really want a filthier subway? I think not. And to speculate that only doing it once in one direction is going to be cheaper and equal to doing it twice, I think is foolhardy. Number three, track inspection. Have you tried to do it with just cameras on a car? If you haven't tried it for a period of time to make sure it works, you are gambling with the public safety. That's not a gamble I am prepared to undertake. Number four, temperature adjustment. What do you want to do, freeze them out? Is that how you want to take care of the subways? Not a wise idea, or boil them out, either which way. Overtime. Overtime has been proven by the City of New York time and again to be cheaper than hiring people to do the job. It saves pension contributions, benefit contributions, and the like. The skillful use of overtime is a plus. The issue lies in whether you are prepared to apply the skill or are capable of doing so. Security posts. Cameras catch people. They do not deter those who commit violence or paint swastikas or the like. They do not deter. This is a foolhardy security investment. Midlife overhaul. The MBFT on the subways has been reduced in many instances. Why do you want to reduce the overhaul? Why do you possibly want to? Bus service reduction. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy, for sure. We've seen time and again, as you reduce buses and as you give worse service, you're going to have a greater problem. I don't know where you are on the Washington Heights thing. Have you abandoned that? All right. Now, let me tell you why I think none of this should be done. None of it. And the fare evasion report that you will hear will show you still another reason, because it's uneconomic. You should use police officers to do the fare evasion. Cost reduction versus saving. We are paying more and more each and every year in workers' compensation. When Ronnie Hakem led the subway system, she was willing to undertake a program that some of us had recommended, which would reduce workers' compensation payments, but not to the people who get it, but to the coterie of lawyers and doctors who scam the system each year for hundreds of millions of dollars. That program is available. Ronnie tried it with Jim Henley. It worked for the short period of time it was tried. The people then left, and we're back in the same rut as before. If it's implemented, you have hundreds of millions of dollars of recurring savings, more than all of these reductions, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Larry, can I?
May I respond to that, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so let's do them in order. First of all, the first opening statement, Commissioner, is I don't want to do any of these things. You make the expression that I want to do them. I don't want to do them. Maybe that I didn't express that sufficiently or adequately in my opening comments, in which case that's to my detriment. I don't want to do any of these things. So I'll do them in the order. Number one, the SBS Eagle squads actually are effective. You said they're useless. They're not actually. The fare evasion on SBS routes is markedly less than an RBS, but I agree with you that outside influences have led to quite an increase in fare evasion, as we'll see in the next presentation. And number two, reduction in cleaning at terminals. Well, I actually said that I don't want to do this. It's counterintuitive. I've set my tenure around improving customer service. So this is something I'm going to keep a very close watch on. We would, as I said to Commissioner Albert, we will choose scientifically where we do it. But the whole reason we introduced, for example, the Group Station Manager Initiative was to drive up standards of cleanliness. But, you know, at the end of the day, when you're faced with monumental savings targets, unless I just say to you as a commission, no, sorry, I refuse, I'm not going to give you any savings, I'm between a rock and a hard place. Number three, the track inspections car. No, well, we do have a track inspection car already. This isn't some new piece of equipment, so we already use it. It's also standard practice in many railways across the world. The Network Rail, for example, use what's called the track inspection train, and that is a proven methodology across the world in railways for being able to identify to the almost to the millimetre where a defect is, such that you can then go in and apply the appropriate remedy. Number four, temperature. All we're saying here is to make sure we don't leave the heating on when it doesn't need to be on, or the aircon on when it doesn't need to be on. The aim is to be a bit more scientific about the ambient temperature. Five, I agree with you about overtime. Absolutely, it's a more efficient way than just adding exponentially to headcount, but the skill, as you say, is how it's applied. Six, you mentioned security post. Seven, midlife overhaul. Yes, we have had a lot of success actually in terms of the overhauls. We believe that it's primarily with the buses. It is the buses. We can, and I'll defer to Darryl for the specifics. We believe that that will not materially affect the MDBF, the mean distance between failure. That actually, because we now have newer buses, modern buses, that they don't require the level of intervention that old buses had to, with many more mechanical parts. The workers' comp issue, that's news to me. Thank you for enlightening me on that. I did not know that. I will talk to Managing Director Hakem about that. So thank you for your comments.
Commissioner Trottenberg.
I mean, look, I think with a little less drama, I obviously share the concerns that Chuck just raised about service diminution on the subways, knowing we're in a tough budgetary situation. But just to come back on the issue of enforcement, and I know we're going to see a presentation, and you're saying, Andy, you're thinking there's this big spike in fare evasion because of what Cy Vance did. But are we seeing that spike in Manhattan only? Because if it's not Manhattan only, then it doesn't really correlate to... Because I don't see a borough-by-borough breakdown.
No, sure. So when we look later, I mean, I haven't said that's the only. I mean, that was what the commissioner said. That's not the only reason. That is a factor. There are other factors. I mean, the level of fare evasion has gone up, but that is a factor. And what's striking is the correlation between that decision being made, the corresponding decline in arrests and in other enforcement activity, and an increase in fare evasion. So I think it is a fairly major factor.
But I guess, are you Are you seeing that in Manhattan? Because, I mean, Cy Vance is the DA for Manhattan.
That's correct.
He's not for the other four. I mean, I guess I feel like people keep pointing the fingers at him, but
No.
I don't see any data that breaks it out by borough. I mean, we'll come back to that,
Sure,
I guess.
but you will see that, and you will see that the Bronx and Staten Island in particular have very high levels of fare evasion, which
So, I
obviously-
mean, I know the DA in Staten Island did not
Nope.
go with this policy, so I'm a little, I don't know that we should pin it on the DA. Okay, but
No, but again, Commissioner, that's why I haven't said, all I've said is that is a factor. I have not said that is the predominant factor, but it's a factor nonetheless.
I don't know if I see the evidence. But here's my other question, though. On the Eagle teams, I, too, share the concern about reducing them because, I mean, if I do the math on the Eagle teams, they're revenue raisers. I mean, I have a bunch of enforcement. I mean, usually enforcement agents are revenue generators, not revenue losers. And just, you know, rough estimate, they don't have to write that many summonses at $100 a summons to, you know, earn their keep and then some. And one thing I've never seen from the MTA is, I mean, when we've always run the SBS program, the MTA has always said, well, the Eagle teams cost money, but I've never seen sort of the revenue side that they bring in. I'd be nervous to reduce their ranks if, I mean, I don't want to reduce their ranks anyways. I think that's going in the wrong direction. But in truth, if they're revenue raisers, then this isn't even a good, you know, economizing effort. So I don't know, maybe Bob or someone can give the answer on that. I mean, are they revenue raisers or not?
Well, I mean, what I would say is they're revenue raisers if people pay the fines, and that's not always the case. But you will see when we come onto the fare evasion report that I've certainly said to my team I would like to see a business case given the amount of revenue at risk, the amount of revenue we're losing. I do believe that there is a case for way more inspection teams, way more Eagle squads, and actually to the point that Commissioner Merdler made, absolutely we want to see the police on the buses and on the subway enforcing this thing. What we're saying in here is we can actually deploy, although it'll be fewer individuals, there will actually be, I think it's 2 more teams. We will actually have 2 more teams across a geographical area rather than specific routes, so we can actually deploy them in a more efficient manner.
So, I mean, we should know what percentage of people are paying their fines. That's a knowable thing, right? I mean, you're implying maybe a lot of people aren't paying the fines, which I don't doubt could be true.
Some don't, but I'd have to
But I
check
mean,
with
what's
my
the
team.
percentage?
We'll have to get that information to you.
It
We
seems
believe
it
it's
seems super relevant
we
for this
believe it's
discussion.
about 50%, Commissioner.
50%, okay.
Ira? Thank you. There's a couple of things here that jump at my eye. The shop plan maintenance efficiency, I think Commissioner Merdler mentioned that. But we're going to a larger cycle for whatever maintenance we're doing here. It just seems to be back in 2009, 2010, we had done things like that, especially with the signal system. And it's, come home to roost. I just wonder if you could comment on that and why that won't have any impact on reliability.
Commissioner, I'll ask Darrell to comment as
Okay.
it relates specifically to the buses and it relates to to modern vehicles. But
Yeah, so that's relegated not just to buses. And it's something that we wanted to do. We hastened that as we had to do this budget exercise. And it relies and leverages on things around EAM, reliability-based maintenance. We're moving away from a historical systems approach and moving more to componentry. And we feel that it won't have any negative impact on reliability. In fact, we believe it will improve it. And it's actually for buses coming, that are to be delivered.
It would
Newer
address
buses.
new buses.
Yes.
Oh, okay, all right. All right. The other, I may have another question. The thing below it too, mandated training reduction. I mean, that seems like a pretty serious training reduction there. Do we think there'll be an impact? I mean, I'm concerned about safety with that.
this relates, Commissioner, to mandated state training, which we believe that we can still derive the benefit, but on a less frequent cycle.
Just one comment about the quote service reductions or service adjustments, actually, as they're portrayed here. which would only take place in 2020. Is that correct? That's correct, right. So, I mean, these are, correct me if I'm wrong, these are things where we're going to look at where we're providing too much service according to our guidelines. Our guidelines are based on how many people ride and how much service we say we put out there. Now, in both on, probably more so on bus than on transit, we don't put out the service we say we put out. Hence, we wind up with very crowded trains and buses and maybe some empty trains and a very inefficient, ineffective use of our equipment for a variety of reasons. On the subway, I guess it's totally attributable to us because we control it. On surface, you could attribute it to DOT, other changes in traffic, whatever. I mean, it would be okay to say, let's go ahead with, for me, it'd be okay to say, go ahead with this if we think our service reliability is going to increase dramatically by then, because then the impact on the passenger would be minimal. But, you know, seeing this here in 2020, I don't think we're going to be at the service reliability that passengers are going to say this is okay. We have complaints of people who say, oh, trains are crowded. We get this rhetoric from people. Trains are very crowded. They say there's a reduction in ridership. And some of the problem is just the reliability of our service creates very crowded trains and buses. So I mean, it's just really a comment. Let's see what happens in the next year or two if we can come up to a decent level. And
Commissioner, I think you make a very valid point. I mean, I have to say, I would never say we're providing too much service. It's more that there is some room to manoeuvre within the tolerances of the guide, loading standards, loading standards on the vehicles. There's some room to manoeuvre, but I wouldn't describe it. I wouldn't want to describe it as too much service. Definitely not. And again, with all of these, I'm hoping that we will secure additional revenue streams such that we don't have to implement them.
Commissioner Weisbrod, you want to go next?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just like to start with a sort of a broader concern about the budget and the budget cuts, and something I've expressed to Bob, which is that we have this budget is, as we know, is structurally unbalanced, but it's also really practically unbalanced because there's $123 million in unidentified savings cuts that it almost seems like we're throwing up our hands and saying we can't close this $123 million gap. And as Bob has said, and I think we are seeing in this discussion, the cupboard is pretty much bare with respect to one-shots. And so we're really talking about, in all likelihood, unless there is a dramatic increase in revenue beyond that which is budgeted here, an additional $123 million in service cuts that we are, if we pass this budget as is, essentially authorizing staff and management to implement without ever coming back to this board for approval. And that just, to me, as we can hear from this discussion, is a cause of great concern. I have to say that having listened to, going to 2 hearings now on the proposed fare increase, that while certainly the public is unhappy about the potential of a fare increase, the deeper concerns were, one, service reliability on the one hand, and second, as Chuck has said, a lot of concern about the unfairness of poor people paying their fares while other people are right in front of them evading their fares. And I know we're going to get a discussion on fare evasion, and I know that discussion is going to be show a dramatic increase in fare evasion, but as far as I know, that discussion is not proposing any approach to address fare evasion. So to me, recognizing the concerns that Andy, you've expressed, or the efficiencies of the Eagle teams, and the concerns about eliminating overtime for police who are dealing with these issues. And I do believe that the comments of and the actions of the Manhattan DA have been most unfortunate in this regard. The fact that we are not preserving in this budget, and in fact not enhancing a budget to address fare evasion, given the impact it's having on the revenue side and the impact it's having on our perception of fairness to our broader customers, concerns me greatly. And so I have deep concerns about all of those, and particularly about the $123 million in looming cuts that we are not going to see until they are implemented, which, if every item in our budget assumptions come home exactly as they are, will be implemented. And then finally, just a very specific question to you, Andy, or to Bob. The terminal car cleaning reduction, I don't recall, was that an element of the subway action plan at all, an enhancement of the terminal car cleaning reduction? And are we now reducing that which we enhanced when we did the subway action plan? Those are my questions.
So I might have to check my facts, Commissioner. I don't believe it was. So we've tried to keep sacrosanct the elements, or SAP elements, so that we're not reversing things for which the city and the state gave us dedicated funding. So I don't believe that was the case. With regard to your earlier comment about fare evasion, the only thing I would gently correct is that there are no actions being taken. I will make that clear that there are myriad actions already underway and additional ones planned when we get onto the fare evasion discussion. We're certainly not passive to it. In fact, we're taking a very aggressive line on it, and I'll explain that in more detail in the session that follows this one.
Okay. And to say, in some respects, since fare evasion does loom heavily over this discussion, it might have been better to have the fare evasion discussion first. But
Commissioner, you asked about the $123 million as of yet unidentified cuts for next year. If you look at this sheet where we talk about what the targets are, this is just, yeah, it's the sheet that we provided, savings targets, yes, in front of you. You'll see that there's $123 million next year, but the next year it's only 58. So in other words, it's not $123 million of recurring savings that we need to implement this year that will go forward. I need 58 and then 82 going forward. So in other words, it's mostly one-shots. It's about $65 million worth of one-shots that we need in 2019, which again can come from deferring an IT project. It could come from pushing something out. It can come from not filling vacancies that we have in addition to what we've already built into the budget. So in terms of the recurring savings, which really are service issues, that's not, the 123 doesn't represent our exposure. And as we've talked, if we're going to reduce service, if it's not guideline service, which you've already approved those parameters, if it's any new service change, that has to come to the board. It has to be subject to public hearing. So that's not something that we're going to do without the board's knowledge or without the public's knowledge. So again, I make those 2 points.
I would just say in response, as you said to us at our last Finance Committee meeting, Bob, that basically the cupboard is bare on one-shots. And so we should be able to know at this point if these are not service cuts, and I think all of us recognize that we certainly hope they're not service cuts, but presumably we know what they are going to be. I just feel very uncomfortable voting for a budget that in effect has a $123 million deficit associated with it.
You have voted for every budget the same way. We have always had unidentified savings targets in every single budget. That is a challenge to the staff, you know, at the agencies and at headquarters to find savings. I did not say we were out. I said it is getting increasingly difficult to find these. That doesn't mean impossible. And it just is more of a challenge, because I can assure you that we are not the most efficient organization that's out there. And we have to get people rethinking what they were doing yesterday for tomorrow, because we can find more savings. But I can assure you that there are not going to be service cuts without public hearings and without board action. That's just the way it has to be. So. I would also, that's a good point, Pat. I'd point out that we have $165 million of our reserve, general reserve there. Don't plan on using it for this, but again, it's less than 1%. But it is still, those are real dollars.
Commissioner Reckler.
Bob, I just want to make sure that we're framing those right in the context. So the savings that we're going through right now, in the presentation that we went through a couple weeks ago that showed the deficit climbing to $991 million, right, a year, that assumes that the savings that we're reviewing actually take place, correct? And that we have the toll and fare increase. Just, okay, I just wanted to make sure, just to put that out there for everyone.
Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, I do have a question about enterprise asset management, but I'm uncomfortable with the clarity of the discussion on the fare beating thing, and let me sort of rephrase what I think you're kind of getting at is there's sort of, Commissioner Mortler's question was the efficiency of, despite the hyperbole, the efficiency of your Eagle teams and your enforcement. And it seems to me that there's a universe of people who are beating fares, and of them there's a percentage who can be discouraged, and they will be discouraged as a function of their expectation of being apprehended and the punishment you impose. So anytime either of those two elements of the function are diminished, the universe of people who think they can beat the fares who have whatever proclivity to do it, will be increased. And if that's a correct understanding of the sort of social function, the social physics of this problem, and whether or not DA Vance's decision is set an example for the outer borough people too, I don't know. I don't know that it's measurable either in Brooklyn. Yeah, well, I don't really know that, but or how that really. That would affect people's expectation of being both apprehended and the severity of the evasion. So you could have a real efficient system if there was real severe penalties. If you're giving out the death penalty every time somebody jumped a turnstile, you probably wouldn't need a lot of people to enforce that, but that's not the sort of thing we do. So the closer it gets to a slap on the wrist, the more people are going to take a shot. And you got to recognize the first meeting in the first fare and toll hearing in Manhattan, I kept a check mark of how many people complained about fare beaters versus how many people said, I feel okay jumping the fare. And there were a few that said they felt okay jumping the fare, but I think it was almost 10-1 in the Manhattan meeting of people complaining about, these are the perceptions of, to the extent you're supposed to listen to the public, that's what the public was saying at those meetings. So, it can't be as entirely useless as Commissioner Mortler stated, but on the other hand, the weaker the penalties are, the more useless the enforcement will be. Everybody could be an agent, but if you're not enforcing it at all, people just keep jumping. Now, on to my serious question here. It's not a huge chunk of money, but as to the enterprise asset management, which pops up as savings in the other agencies' budgets as well. first of all, I mean, I'm curious, what's the total number of heads you have working on that right now? I mean, you cut 16 of them in 2000. I mean, I just look at the heads rather than the numbers. So you cut 16 positions in 2018, and you're cutting 36 in 2019. But these are people that isn't the purpose of the enterprise asset management a productivity function itself? And so what do you even have a department for other than the mandates of the government to make you have a department doing this if you're whacking away at the people who are making these decisions? I understand that these are not the sort of decisions that computers do make better than people. You do need people to look at these things and say, I mean, at least that's my understanding of it, or we just plug in a program and start cutting jobs. But, was that a muddled enough question for you? Should leave you open field.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please? Jay.
Sure. So this reduction is really just having less growth in the program. We are reducing the growth by 36 positions. In 2019, we'll still have a robust program of 107 positions, and that grows in 2020 to 120 positions. So we're still continuing the program, just less growth.
Okay, unless any other member of the Finance Committee has any other questions, we're going to move on to MTA Bus. And I would just ask members of the committee, if you have any additional questions on fare evasion, let's hold it until we get to the fare evasion so we can get through the rest of this stuff and keep things moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. MTA Bus July and November plans provide roughly $120 million in savings through the plan period, with roughly $19 million for 2019, and they could be summarized by two major initiatives. The first is a rationalization of weekday and weekend express bus service to more closely align with customer demand. Historically, service adjustments were primarily put forward to address overcrowding, but not in the reverse case where customers' demand have contracted. Since 2008, MTA Bus Express ridership has decreased by 29% due to in part slow bus speeds and customer demographical changes. Today, express bus routes account for roughly 6.4% of the MTA bus ridership, but about 40% of the fleet size. Most of the proposed express service rationalization converts routes into peak hour, peak direction, traditional express service when customer demand is at its highest. In proposing revisions to service, we have taken into consideration alternative travel options. The second initiative, as we referenced earlier, entails transitioning our bus overhaul program from a 4- and 8-year to a midlife 6-year schedule, starting with newer buses. This is an operational initiative that we were prepared to undertake regardless of the current financial environment. The initiative leverages current EAM analysis and advanced vehicle monitoring systems that allow us to track failures early and identify more accurate replacement cycles. In short, it puts in place a more effective and efficient maintenance strategy and helps normalize shop program workload. This is in line with maintenance best practice across the industry, and we do not expect that it will have any negative impact to reliability. And we're open for any questions.
Does anybody on the Finance Committee have any questions regarding the MTA bus reductions? Or plan, I should call it. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on to... I got it. I understand, I know. Thank you, Bob. We're going to go next to Long Island Railroad.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Long Island Railroad November plan has a number of initiatives to identify savings totaling for the 5-year period of $330 million approximately. In 2019, we're looking at $63 million in savings and slowly going up to about $75 million in 2022. And what we did is we took a look at how to initiate efficiencies in the railroad and not have any service cuts to our customers. So a lot of this was as similar as the other agencies in terms of deferring hiring, eliminating some hiring of positions, and scaling back the growth of certain areas in terms of where we wanted to accelerate work, such as while we increased car cleaning from where we were, we didn't increase it to the level of earlier projections, but what we did do is then assigned and how we positioned the folks to ensure that we still had similar cleaning across the railroad and still have a better environment for our customers. We also took a look at how we were doing things with Long Island Railroad Forward, and with regards to still focusing our resources on addressing those components that fail the most and cause the most issues, but then at the same time identifying where we could be more efficient with components that are not failing as frequently, showing more reliability, and or where past efforts have shown to improve reliability. So for instance, on our fleet, while we are still focused on addressing thresholds and the issues that were a result of those, we're able to find some efficiencies with regards to car door controls and trucks on our car fleet. So those areas we could find some savings with regards to how we assign staff to work on that. Same thing goes for infrastructure. Track, signal, again, we've been very proactive with regards to ensuring we tackle those areas where we have most problems, and at the same time looking to see where we can reduce costs. For instance, with the new strategy of getting in, repairing, and replacing, we're looking to see for efficiencies with regards to stocking material components and then buying materials at the right time versus having materials ordered further in advance. We have also taken a look at efficiencies with regards to how we operate our fleet, where we can find savings with regards to power consumption, and taking advantage of taking a look at how we're billed for our power and how we, during construction activities, perhaps have less power consumption and look for savings in those. And then some of the other things where I was looking to accelerate, such as implementation of help points versus so we'll look to pull that back but still proceed and address help points throughout the system as we go and do work in those stations versus trying to proactively install them on their own. And then other areas where, again, further efficiencies, event-type situations where we can perhaps take a look at staffing for special events and also look at opportunities to find efficiencies in ticket sales. So it really was trying to ensure we did not have service cuts and at the same time look for those efficiencies that not only will help us now, but continue to produce savings, long term.
Thank you, Phil. Do we have any questions for the president of Long Island Railroad? Ira?
Just brief, I compliment you on looking at PREA and getting some money out of Amtrak, but this is a whole discussion about fare evasion. We see this presentation of New York City Transit. Do we have estimates on Long Island Railroad about how many people are not paying fares?
We do have some information on fares. What we do is where we have areas where we've identified fare evasion issues, we do have additional conductors that we assign to those locations to try and collect those revenue. I believe the figure, Mark, is 20.
And this is consistent with Metro North. Both the railroads utilize MTA audit, which goes undercover, and they do sort of spot checks on rates of fare not collected. And at Long Island Railroad, those observations have shown hovering around a 5% range. So we at the finance office take those numbers and need to make assumptions about who of those people have already paid for monthly, weekly tickets. We think the estimate is roughly $20 million per year, potentially, as lost revenue. And as Phil says, what our strategy is primarily is to deploy extra collectors on particularly crowded trains. About 160 tours per week are assigned to those crowded trains. They're scheduled. And then another 40 are more roving extra collectors that we can assign really more freely to different places on the spot. And that's one of our major ways that we attempt to combat fare evasion.
Commissioner Merdler.
Permit me to focus on avoiding some of these reductions by increasing revenue. I know that Mr. Lieber has started to focus on the sale of and use of development rights. The Long Island Railroad has an abundance of development rights or air rights that need to be sold or leased that can raise revenue. And that where you own the parking lots at various stations, that provides an opportunity for generating revenue, as Mr. Lieber has started to do with his people. I would urge you to expand it dramatically. So, for example, you own the air rights over the Long Island Railroad tracks. You own them over the stations. You can, under appropriate circumstances, under state law passed at the behest of the governor in 2016 and 2017, have the right to use those air rights to develop them and to sell them and to raise an enormous amount of money, as does Metro North, and indeed as does New York City Transit. You ought to start doing that. I know that Jano is focused on that, but I think you really ought to escalate that effort, because that's one way of avoiding or minimizing the reductions you're contemplating. Thank you.
Thank you. Unless there's any other questions, we're going to move on to Metro North, please.
Thank you. I'm going to essentially repeat a lot of the themes that Andy, Darrell, and Phil have already touched upon. Our proposed budget reduction program realizes $209 million in savings over the 5-year plan period, and roughly $49 million in 2019. Many of those reductions relate to reductions in expenses such as professional services, legal expenses, outside training, marketing. These are based upon lower spending trends as well as various cost containment efforts. Similarly, we will be reducing supplies and materials based upon past spending trends. In terms of more specific customer-facing initiatives, we, like the Long Island, don't have any reductions in service per se. We have made certain changes in maintenance cycles for rolling stock components. So, for example, we have obtained from the FRA approval to extend the M8 air brake maintenance cycle from 5 years to 6 years. We will also be deferring the replacement of the M8 seats for 2 years. We propose to close 3 ticket offices, Mount Vernon West, Scarsdale, and Brewster. With the advent of our e-TICS program, we've had a nice take-up on e-TICS, so we are actually moving to realize efficiencies in terms of how we sell our tickets. In addition, last year we had requested as a new need to add 5 positions to provide for greater weekend coverage at Grand Central Terminal. That would have been a supervisor, 2 plumbers, and 2 electricians. We never actually filled those positions, so we would propose to eliminate those as savings in the current BRP exercise. In addition, we are looking to extend our car and coach cleaning cycle. Currently, there's an e-cleaning, which is the extensive extraordinary cleaning that's done every 92 days as part of our regular PI cycle. We essentially would be looking to double that and do that cleaning every 184 days. This will not change the regular interval for the ordinary cleaning. This is just the e-cleaning cycle, which we would be essentially doubling that interval. In addition, back on the savings side, we were recently, I think 2 months ago, we received ISO 50001 energy certificate. We have to implement 3 projects every year to reduce consumption. Those savings are factored in here. And also because of some scheduling changes, we expect to be reducing some revenue service car miles, which also results in energy savings. So that essentially is an overview of what's in our BRP program. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Commissioner?
One minor question, Kathy, and then one more major question related to our finance role today. So with my Metro North hat on, do you have any sense of how many people use the Brewster ticket window?
Sorry, we can get you that information. Yeah, I don't know that off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a small station in a small county. If you don't mind, I would like to know that.
I'll find that out.
If I may, sir, since this is a finance committee meeting, not a Metro North committee, I'm just going to make a finance committee point or question. So one, I want to thank all you guys. These are very difficult cuts to make, and I think they're very helpful to clarify for us, but of course they're insufficient to close this yawning gap we've got. Scott said it, we got $1 billion gap 3 and some odd years out. That is an incredible number, and I ask us to keep focusing on the forest, not the trees. I find this conversation to be the trees. $1 billion is a frighteningly large deficit, and that's inclusive, as Scott said, of achieving these savings, both identified and unidentified. The macro issue is that we're raising labor costs 3% a year over this period, and non-labor 1.6%, and we're only raising the 1/3 that we control 2% every year, or 4% every 2 years. You can't make that math work. If labor goes up 3%, and our costs, the part we control, only goes up 2%, that's 1% every year you're behind. That is a train collision or an iceberg. We're arguing over how to slice up a pie that's shrinking. I deal with a lot of clients that have the same situation, and it's not pretty that we fight over a shrinking pie. And I ask you, I guess, Bob, and then via your colleagues, and I've asked you this before, are we at bone at this point on a cost takeout perspective? Because I'll tell you that when we start taking half of the reserve out, I would use that as an indication that we are getting close to bone.
As we said, without additional revenues, there will need to be either personnel actions that are taken or radical changes. There is perhaps restructuring yet to be done for the MTA as a whole that can generate savings. There are things that we can do, but they are not going to be at the margin. It's got to be something bigger. And to do that, I think we can do it and still perhaps increase the efficiency of the organization, increase the delivery of the service people want, but it's going to be dramatic.
Okay, Commission.
Two things. First, thank you. I think many of these cuts do bring about efficiencies, and all of us are happy to see that because we recognize that in such a large agency it's very difficult to be efficient. Nonetheless, to echo Neil and Bob, we can't save our way out of this hole. We really need to come up with new ways to fund us. And my second question goes to Kathy. Do we know for Metro North the dollar amount of fare evasion? I'm just curious about what it is agency-wide, and now we've got two numbers coming to us.
Yeah, so Mark sort of spoke to the program that we have in place with MTA Audit. They do sort of spot checks on a monthly basis and provide us with information in terms of what they see as trends. So I would note that we're really focused more on the non-commutation side, because on the commutation side, people have actually prepaid, right? So if you don't collect the ticket, it doesn't matter. So in terms of what we estimate based upon the work that MTA Audit has done, we're estimating a range of between 2.5 and 3% of fares not being collected, which equates to a range of between $9.5 and $11.5 million.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, can we go to MTA quarters? Who's going to do that presentation?
B&T too.
We have B&T. All right, we'll do bridges and tunnels first.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, board members. So I guess the short story is ORT, and the switch to ORT is delivering the benefits that were expected on both fronts, both in terms of improving the customer experience as well as enabling us to find cost reductions. And so the efficiencies that we found and are able to turn back in as part of the budget program reduction are, for the most part, the dollars that are represented here. Of the $185 million that will be saved over the 5-year period, $137 million of that is directly related to the ORT initiatives. But in addition to ORT, saving us directly, there were some other indirect costs associated with capital work that would have otherwise been supported by operating dollars that we were also able to receive. And similar to the other organizations, we were able to take a good hard look at administrative costs associated with unnecessary hires, seminars, and things like that to be able to achieve these savings. But at the end of the day, we're still most focused on ensuring that we maintain appropriate service levels through our facilities. Safe roadways are key to us. Protecting revenue is of tremendous importance to us, and that's one of the things that we focus on tremendously. And at the same time, we're also very much focused on the delivery of the capital program, which is something that we are tied to, both in terms of maintaining an acceptable level of mobility through region, as well as delivering the work. So with that, I'll end and ask if there are any questions. I'll be happy to take them.
Commissioner?
Yeah, this is a question maybe to you, maybe to Bob, maybe to Pat Foy on the revenue side. I appreciate that one component of our fare increase on the revenue side is increases in bridge and tunnel tolls. And as we now think about congestion pricing, it strikes me that this is a moment to think about how we can, within this proposed new fare structure, time zone fares particularly for trucks, so that it is more, there are higher tolls during business hours and lower tolls during non-business hours to ease congestion in the city and do it in a way that is revenue neutral with respect to the proposed fare increase for bridges and tunnels.
So I'll go first. I mean, we look at the data all the time, and what we know is that for the AM peak in particular, there's 23% of our traffic is trucks, and for the PM peak, 16%. And so overall, trucks represent about 6.7% of our total traffic. They represent about 18% of the revenue. Now, last year, as part of the Summer from Hell, we ran a program where there was a pricing incentive where there was a 50% discount on trucks, a discount, not a higher price, but a discount. And that was to induce them to move out of the daytime operating periods. And even with the 50% price reduction, we saw very little movement of truck activity. Notwithstanding, though, I believe that we have enough data to support the notion of creating variable pricing structures that could have an impact on truck activity.
Thank you very much. And I would ask if I realize that we're not voting on a fare increase at all, or the specifics of a fare increase at all, or a fare increase in this budget, but we may well be doing that in January. And so it seems to me that this is, especially as we think of congestion pricing and the importance of reducing vehicles coming into our central business district during business hours, that this is the moment to do that. And I appreciate that the Port Authority has done this to some extent, and I would ask that this be looked at very, very carefully as we consider a fare increase for January, and ideally have this included in that proposal. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to, I'm sorry, Commissioner Brown.
Yeah, to Cedric, really, and or it's a policy question for everybody. Really, it's fairly well established, and people I talk to at least, that there's a MTA toll tarantella as a function of the one-way toll on the Verrazano Bridge. I'm aware it's a federal legislation, But it seems to be fruit that's hanging so low that the fruit is actually on the ground. And why can't somebody pick that up? And I mean, Port Authorities, you mentioned Port Authorities, Carl mentioned Port Authorities policies. Port Authority doesn't have that problem, so that when they implement a toll increase, they get the effect of the toll increase, both for discouraging traffic and for encouraging revenue. And I just suggest that a lot of the things we do is like pushing against a string with regard to toll incentives. You gave the trucks a toll, you gave a toll incentive to get them to move hours. Well, these people are very locked into their schedule. They're very locked into their labor time. They're very locked into their customers. And they're not about to change that, especially when you have long-term incentives, perverse incentives, like the MTA toll tarantella. So who's doing anything about that? Where it's federal legislation, but I don't see how and is there a measure of how much is lost in bridge and tunnel revenue to people not paying in the morning at the Verrazano and then flying out for free down Canal Street in the afternoon? I'm not the only one that observes this.
Say nothing of the mess it creates at Canal Street.
Yeah.
The BQE, which I will hold forth on in a minute.
So broadly stated, we're getting ready to release the study that talks about the impact of one-way travel at the Verrazano, and it was specifically designed to address the imbalance of how many people go east and don't come back west. And it was looking to understand congestion in South Brooklyn, as well as the Gowanus, as well as in on Canal Street. And the high level, some of the high level results are the unbalance isn't as large as we thought it was. It ends up being approximately around 7,000 vehicles who choose to go east but then don't come back west. A lot of them will, according to the study, revert that, and they will start coming back westbound. But what was most interesting is that the improvements in those three areas in question, whether it was South Brooklyn or Gowanus or at Canal Street, during the peak periods, you don't see real significant improvement in traffic per se. What you begin to see is that during the off-peak periods, people begin to make different kinds of travel decisions as a result of putting in two-way toll. Notwithstanding, we understand that there are benefits to have it considered, and as you mentioned out, though, it was put in place as a result of federal action, and it would require federal action to undo it.
I just want to say I'm really looking forward to seeing that study. Obviously, the city has the very unenviable task of figuring out how to rehabilitate and replace the BQE, and one thing we've heard loud and clear, and I totally understand, is the desire, I think, to look writ large at bridge and tunnel movements with both of the agencies sort of who are involved in that, Port Authority and the MTA, but also very much anything we can do to reduce the volumes on the BQE during the whole construction period. And I think a lot of people hope that if we could down in Washington, we have a new congressman from Staten Island who seems interested in fixing this. Even if it only helps a little bit, I think we'd certainly be enthusiastic about trying to get that thing through Congress. Thanks, Senator.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Why don't we go to MTA headquarters now?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Over the plan period, headquarters has identified $164 million in savings, and it can be grouped into three separate categories: savings from efficiencies, right-sizing the budget, and spending restrictions; savings from hiring restrictions and the elimination of vacancies; and savings from the deployment of MTA police officers on regular time rather than overtime to interact with the homeless individuals within the commuter rail systems. Like the other agencies, we've gone through and really tightened up all the departments' budgets and eliminated spending on memberships, subscriptions, reduction on outside services and usage of consultants, elimination of unnecessary travel, reduced software needs. And any questions?
Does anybody have any questions? Commissioner?
It's well, it's not really about MTA headquarters so much, but the fee that we pay when we do refinancing and bond issues to the state, is that still being waived by budget?
Yes, that's being waived.
Yes, sir. Do I mind? No, I don't
Oh,
mind.
sorry.
I look forward to hearing your question.
That's funny. On a very, very serious note, this weekend was the 5th anniversary of Spite and Dival. My neighbor, Jim Lovell, passed away. His wife, Nancy Montgomery, who's now our first Democrat in a long time on our county legislature, is the suffering widow from that. I see that you're going to, quote, right-size the all-agency sleep apnea awareness and support. Can someone just give me some clarity about what that means? Because, and that will beg the question about where we stand with our sleep apnea, which I won't ask in this meeting, but I'd love to hear later, because anything that would harm the application and assessment of that clear indicator and cause of that accident crash would I'd be concerned about.
So the costs that headquarters had included in our budget, which is being reduced now, are totally administrative costs. It is not the actual testing for sleep apnea, which is covered underneath the employee's health insurance.
Okay, before we go to fair evasion, I figured I'd reserve my own comments till the end, so I let everyone else have a chance to ask their questions. So just a couple of things. One is, I don't think there's anybody on the board that doesn't realize and has advocated that there's a need for increased revenue going forward. And what the amount is and where it comes from, that is something that will be discussed and debated not only by the board, but also in Albany and in Washington. At the same time, I do believe there's more that can be saved out of this agency through increased productivity, through improved efficiencies. While I think we've made a lot of progress, I still think there's a lot of progress that can be made. And I certainly don't want a message to go out that while I do agree we can't save our way out of this predicament, I also don't want people to think that they could just sit back on their laurels because revenue from heaven is just going to drop down on the MTA and solve everything. That's not the case. So we got to continue to make the ongoing progress, which I do believe will happen under the leadership of our presidents, to increase accountability and ownership, continue to increase performance. And we also, as a committee, need to focus on things that are big cost drivers, whether it's workers' comp, whether it's future labor contracts, and other things like that, where there can be big savings. I'm not here to micromanage the agencies and the departments. Clearly, it's always good to get the specificity so that board members can have a chance to ask questions and get information. But we need to figure out on the things that are big cost drivers, not just only on the operating side, but on the capital side, through the work that Scott and his committee have done, through Chuck Merdler's procurement committee. These things can generate huge savings that will also provide additional, whether it's debt relief or operating relief to the agency. So the last thing I just want to say, because we're rapidly approaching the end of this year, my message to the agency is the following. We know what the problems are. What we have to do now is implement the solutions to the problems, and we have to do it quickly. We don't have 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. We have to do them immediately. And when we come up with ideas and solutions, it's incumbent on the leadership of the agency to make sure those things get implemented quickly and they're done effectively throughout the year. Because I'm sure we're going to hear on fair evasion, there's not a lack of coming up with ideas and solutions. The things where things get a little gray and murky sometimes is the lack of ongoing enforcement and follow-up and whatnot. So I just want to make sure that going forward, we need to continue to put the pedal to the metal, as they say, and continuing to look for efficiencies, increase productivity, and savings, because that is the only way we're going to improve the reliability of our system, and while we continue to work to get the additional revenue that's needed, both on the operating and capital side. With that, I thank you for your patience with that. And Tim or Andy, are you going to, who's doing the fare evasion?
So it will be a joint effort, Chair, between
Who's going to
Tim
go
and myself.
first?
I'm going to kick off.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just put the presentation up, please. Just let that go round. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll get started, and we'll go to the first slide in a second. But what I wanted to do was just start off by, and it's actually a very useful segue, Mr. Chairman, from what you just said. You said, and I wrote it down, that we need to implement solutions quickly and effectively embed them quickly and effectively. I entirely agree with you. Whenever you take over an agency, there are a number of things that you need to do due diligence on. And one on my list of due diligence items, you look at what the prevailing safety culture is in an organization to make sure that you are doing the right things to keep people safe. But one of the other things that you definitely have a look at is what is the prevailing economic health, if you like, vitality of that organization. Where are you efficient? Where aren't you efficient? And certainly, as someone who's run a few transit agencies, you have a look at something as critical as fare evasion. So this was very much an early item of scrutiny for me, and in the 11 months I've been here, we have already been taking action to address what is and it's not unique to New York City Transit, but it is an increasing problem. So we might just go to the first slide. I'll talk to this one, and then I'll let Tim take you through the rest of the slides. So let's get the context. So on this slide, and it's easier seen probably on your hard copy, what you can see there, and you need to understand how the graph works. The scaling is proportional because obviously we have more subway riders than we do buses. But let's cut straight to the chase. We estimate for 2018 the revenue loss to fare evasion to be $215 million, which is a huge amount in anyone's terminology, and certainly that is a very large amount compared to where else I've worked, particularly when you look at the percentages. When I looked at the subway percentages initially, that's quite encouraging. It seems like an odd thing to say, but 1.6% for subway fare evasion, not atypical in world subways. Depends where you are, but you can see a real worsening on the bottom, the blue line, in recent months. Over the last year, effectively, you've gone from what was static around 1.6, around 2% fare evasion, has suddenly jumped up to 3.8. Similarly, the buses have progressively and relentlessly increased to around 350,000 daily fare evaders, or just north of 16% fare evasion. So the breakdown is 96 million for subways, 119 million for buses. So this is a huge amount. So what are we doing about it? Again, it's back to that point I made about as soon as I got here, we really started to hone in on this as a team. So there's a number of things that we've done. Some of them are joint efforts with NYPD, some are bespoke to New York City Transit. Mindful of the fact that and we'll come on to this later, the actual regime changed in terms of messaging around whether people would be prosecuted for fare evasion, just a statement of fact. We have worked very closely with NYPD to get NYPD back onto the subway and to get them actively addressing fare evasion. So we have regular dialogue now. We have 2,600 NYPD Transit Bureau officers. We've asked the police chief that they should be assigned to the subway system and onto buses with their colleagues topside to effectively create fare evasion strike teams. So that is now happening. We have done more work to have that be a joint effort with our existing Eagle teams. So we beefed up the Eagle teams by having police officers attend with the Eagle teams. We, as you know, launched in September, I think it was, the new group station manager concept. Group station managers have been launched. They're out there in all of the groups now across the whole of the subway. They work in close coordination with another new initiative, which is neighborhood coordination officers. These are police officers who are assigned to specific locations, specific groups of stations, same as the GSMs. Why is that relevant to this discussion? Because they know what goes on at their individual stations. They know where the fare evasion is happening. They know who the regular offenders are, and that enables us to take more effective enforcement action. I've tasked my SVP for Safety and Security to review available camera feeds so that we can identify who's doing this, where they're doing it, when they're doing it, and such that you have an intelligence-led enforcement strategy rather than just sending people out willy-nilly. You are applying some science behind setting what's still finite resource, be they Eagle teams, NYPD, or the Transit Bureau. You are putting them at those locations where the most offences are happening and at the times of day when they're most happening. So it's very much intelligence-led. Similarly, not just subways, the same approach for buses. We've got intel on what's happening with regard to the bus corridors. So we're working with local precincts to now again put cops boarding buses again in an intelligence-led manner so that we are providing unpredictable inspections so that deterrent impact is felt by people who are the chancers to whom I referred earlier on. We are requiring the Transit Bureau, we're holding them accountable. We're saying to them, we want to know, we're not just going to take your word for it. We want to know, where have you put fare evasion deployment resources? Where have your officers been? How many actions have they issued on a weekly basis? How many tickets effectively have they served? How many summonses have they issued? And that is being pulled together now into a new report that will go into the monthly Transit and Bus Committee book so that you as a board and through you, the members of the public, will be able to see that we're not just talking about this, we're actively doing something about it. With regard to pure NYCT efforts, we are reviewing best practices in terms of fare evasion combat tactics to make sure that we're doing the right things. We have instructed the group station managers and their teams to be out there actually standing on fare arrays so that they are by, for example, the assistance gate, which it tends to be the point of greatest abuse, as you'll see when we come onto the presentation. We are looking to put our wayfinders, the people that are the meeters and greeters at the stations. They do a great job, but it would be beneficial if they were to be in and around the fare arrays so that they can still provide customer service, but that they can provide visible deterrent to people who are minded to walk through when they shouldn't. We are exploring the use of video monitors, a bit like you see in shops, where you, as you walk into a shop to deter would-be shoplifters, that you will see a monitor that will show you with appropriate, very clear signage, not ambiguous, but very clear signage to say you are on candid camera for your safety and security. This area is being video monitored, and we're looking to leverage the existing CCTV systems and the associated conduit to provide those kind of arrays. We are developing a program to expand fare array surveillance using our wireless camera methodology at systems. Already, anti-fare evasion signage has gone up at all of the subway stations. It's about to go up on all of the buses. Because although it seems like an obvious point to make, I don't want anyone trying to say, I didn't know that you had to have a ticket. I didn't know that if you forget your Metro card, you're supposed to still pay. You do not now have that excuse. There's very, very clear signage up on the stations. That's all gone up in recent months. It's about to go up on all the buses. It's happening at the moment. We've put up posters around the stations to remind people that they are covered by video surveillance, and that can be used to detect and prosecute fare evasion. We are, as I mentioned earlier, already piloting the use of Eagle teams on local bus routes, not just the SBS, but local bus routes, again, intelligence-led, those routes that have the highest fare evasion, and those are in the Bronx and on Staten Island. We're increasing the number of random Eagle team blitzes on buses. We're reviewing the use of the service gates, making sure the service gates, the magnets are working properly, that they're kept clean, that the magnetic field is strong enough so that the gate shuts and can't be pushed from the unpaid side. We are exploring legislative support for our higher fare fine structure, and we're about to introduce random revenue, what I call protection blockades, something we used to do on the Tube and at British Rail and in Railcorp when I worked in Australia, whereby we will get teams of people from head office to, on a random basis, go and either ride buses or to go and stand on gate arrays at stations to provide a physical block to make sure you must have a ticket before you go into the station or onto that bus. We will, of course, have police and or Eagle teams with us to provide the backup that we would need. So that's just my initial list. This is something that we take extremely seriously. It is not unique to transit, but it is this comes at a huge cost. So I wanted to say that straight up. I think we should now go to Tim to take us through our methodology and what's behind some of these increases in fare evasion. Tim.
Yeah, so the first chart shows you the quarterly numbers, and as President Byford mentioned, it's scaled differently in terms of the percentages between buses and subways, but to show the proportional ridership, sort of in terms of the estimated number of evaders per day, it's scaled to be proportional to that factor. Going forward, talking about our methodology, we estimate fare evasion rates with field staff that goes out and makes observation. We obviously have an extensive system, and to cover it all requires us to do sampling. It's a pretty modest effort overall, but we cover a tremendous number of our station control areas and our bus routes per quarter, 180 control areas and 140 routes per quarter. We randomize and stratify the stations by volume. We go at different times of the day and cover all 7 days a week. The process for calculation fare evasion on the select bus service is somewhat different. Select bus service already has the increased presence of the Eagle teams, and the Eagle teams in a similar fashion in terms of stratifying and randomized conduct surges where, in addition to identifying evaders, also sort of compares it to the same count of paid ridership aboard those buses. So they do sampling in that fashion. So this creates a sampled rate that's applied across the entire ridership. It produces numbers on a system-wide basis, on a quarterly basis, that are very reliable. However, due to the sampling, we can't parse those samples down to specific stations or specific routes with the same degree of confidence and reliability. I would also just point out there's limitations to humans making observations of these activities, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in control areas. Sometimes there's multiple service gates, multiple turnstiles. Sometimes the presence of the field staff itself may change what happens out there in the field. And so, if anything, I believe these numbers are biased somewhat towards an undercount.
Do you have a sense, Tim, of to what extent that bias might be? I mean,
numerically, no. I mean, statistically, these samples are very sufficient for quality system-wide numbers, but we don't have a reliable way of testing those limitations. And really, that's coming up with the numerator. The denominator is very reliable because that's the swipes.
Right.
So, we know that that's correct.
And just going back to the chart for a second, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to go back to the chart for a second, and appreciating the methodology and the attention that we're now paying to this, is as we look at the historical data on this chart going back to 13, was that the same methodology that we've used throughout?
Yes, absolutely. So this next chart, and we need to make sure that you understand it because some people find it confusing, but this gets to the biggest question that was raised in our prior discussions about the relationship between fare evasion and the changes in ridership that we've experienced. So what this looks at is the marginal change in ridership from 2015 to year-to-date paid ridership counts for 18, and first for subways and then for buses. Again, scaled, subways is much higher because there's significantly more riders. So over that period for subways, you see a 4.3% paid ridership decline, and that's what we report at the monthly committee meetings. And then the red and pink bars break down that overall decline into the component parts of how much of that decline was due to an increase in fare evasion, because fare evasion, if it remains constant, doesn't affect your ridership dynamics. It's only when fare evasion changes, increase or decrease, that it affects those numbers. So here we see over this time period, over a third of that paid ridership decline that we reported to you on really came from increased fare evasion. So 87,000 additional weekday fare evaders drove a paid ridership reduction of 1.5%, a little over a third of the 4.3. And the remaining portion was actually fewer paid customers on the train. So that actually, the pink bar, as it were, is the true adjusted for fare evasion decline in ridership over the period.
Do we have any estimates on the issue of weekend fare evasion?
We do. Our numbers include weekends. We sort of laid out this chart on a weekday because that drives the volume as an illustrative purpose of how much it is. But we have information about weekends and some information about different times of days in terms of what's relatively more problematic from a fare evasion rate. And it comports somewhat with your intuition on the subway side,
right,
where there's more fare evasion in the off-peak hours and less during the peak. A little bit less intuitive on the bus side. Okay. Where the morning peak is a big portion.
I'd be interested in that backup data.
You bet. And moving on to the bus chart, bigger decrease over the time period in paid ridership, 12.3%, and a much bigger portion of that, 56% by this estimate, nearly 7% of that driven by the increase in fare evasion. So back in July when we talked about ridership, and the question was raised, we said we believe up to 50% of the ridership decline is fare evasion. Here we have more specific data for year-to-date, which puts it over 50% and over a third on subways as well. So
Tim, Andy said, maybe this is a question to Andy, but he said the standard for subway fare evasion nationally or internationally was about 1.6 to 2%. Is there a similar standard for buses?
We're gonna go right there with the next slides.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you for the transition. So comparing ourselves to other global metro peers in terms of fare evasion, first on subways, you can see from 2013, 2016, the gray bars depict the highest rate among our peers, the lowest rate among our peers, and the average. And our subway fare evasion rate was sort of well below the average over that time period. In 2017, and we've added 2018 year to date, you can see that while our peers showed some improvement, our rates deteriorated and brought us above the average in 17 and more significantly above the average year-to-date in 18. For buses, to your question, different pattern. Even historically, we've been higher than our global peers on the rate of bus fare evasion. The average for our peers, historically 3.2, and our historical rate nearly triple that. A little different pattern 17, deterioration from our peers, but more deterioration from ourselves that puts us even higher above those benchmarks.
I have a couple of questions. If I should have asked when you were on the subway portion, but you transitioned quickly. So the cameras at the fare control areas that Andy mentioned that were coming, do we have a schedule as to how soon that will be?
We have cameras at a significant portion of our stations now.
At the fare control areas?
At the fare control areas. Yeah. It's really about continuing that effort and ramping it up to have even greater coverage.
Has locking of the slam gates ever been considered, except during emergencies?
The slam gates should be locked except when they're opened, right? So one of the things that President Byford mentioned is a review and a survey to make sure mechanically that those gates are maintained, the magnets are operating, and we're also looking into whether it's possible to have a monitoring system so that we can know if it's not insufficient contact or adhesive or tape or something's come between that connection that makes that, because as you'll see, the gates are the #1 problem.
And Tim, but who looks at the film? Who looks at the pictures? Who enforces it?
I'm almost done. These figures that you're reporting, do they include Staten Island Railway?
No, they don't. The subway figures do not include Staten Island Railway.
Because you know that's a real problem, especially since you're not even expected to pay a fare between Tompkinsville and Tottenville, the only place on the entire MTA network where you're not even expected.
Yeah, it's a totally different system.
Yep. Thank you.
Who looks at the picture that you see on the camera? Who looks at it? And when?
Sorry about that. We actually do look at video that is taken from our PID cameras that are actually at the photo arrays to see if we see anybody actually beating the fare. At that point, we do make notifications to the police department as far as if we see anybody actually going through. If we see I would say a large amount of people actually going through that fare array.
Correct that by the time you have notified the police and the police have gotten there, the person is long gone.
That is true, but what usually happens is that people do become creatures of habit and actually go through it again and again and again. So that's why.
And also, the other thing I would add is it's not just having the cameras, but it's the other things that I listed, also an increased presence actually standing in and around the fare array. So it's got to be seen in totality.
And is the selling of swipes considered in the fare evasion statistics?
The selling of swipes, when it's observed, is part of the observed count, right? That has a more attenuated impact. I would say that's a very, very small picture. That is a different problem. It is a significant and substantial problem, particularly as it affects the environment and the customer service feelings for our customers. And we work aggressively with the NYPD Transit Bureau on that. But this problem is far more widespread. So moving ahead to sort of fare evasion and how it happens. Fare evasion through the subway gate has increased 8-fold over the past several years. So that's the primary means in which fare evasion happens in the subway. The gate's open for someone else's exit or someone's entry, and additional people come through. On the bus side, it's the front door, not the back door. This is a little bit counterintuitive, but the front door fare evasion has increased 3-fold over that same period. And I would point out here that the numbers on the bar chart are local bus service, excluding select bus service. So the overall rate for 18 year to date is 17.2, but on RBS, the local bus, it's 19.5. That's, averaged together with the SBS rate of 2.2. So as to the efficacy of the Eagle teams, the Eagle teams are being tremendously successful and effective in bringing down the evasion rate and keeping it low on SBS. And actually, as we expanded the SBS routes, there's the possibility that evaders got pushed off of those routes back onto the regular bus system and was part of the factor in increasing the evasion rates we see on the RBS system. But again, primary point of entry, front door.
Tim? Oh, go ahead, Ira.
Tim, this whole presentation excludes MTA bus figures?
It excludes MTA bus. It includes SBS in places and local bus others.
Right, but MTA bus is excluded completely.
Correct.
Are there numbers for MTA bus?
Yes, there is.
Oh, okay. Are they better than this?
MTA bus local fare evasion hovers around 7%, and primarily it's not as significant as it is on transit, as MTA local service is mainly a Queens phenomenon as opposed to the Bronx and Staten Island on transit.
Tim?
Just to understand that, you're saying, if I understand what you're saying, is that the difference is geographic probably more than
behavioral,
functional, or it's a geographic difference.
Oh, I didn't realize you were pointing to. Yeah, so what we do know is that we've seen significant increases in fare evasion in two boroughs, Staten Island and the Bronx, for various reasons.
Tim, I just wanted to say, since fare evasion is a mindset, have you noticed any correlation between where buses feed into a subway and fare evasion at that location? Because if you're beating it on the buses, there's a good chance you're going to beat it on the subway as well.
Yeah, as I said, the granularity of our sample doesn't allow us to match up sort of origin destination that finely. But I want to get to the final graph, which really looks at the relationship between enforcement.
Can you just answer one other question? I apologize.
Sorry.
I don't use a New York City bus, so just educate me, and if anybody else on the board needs to hear this. It seems that on the buses, the huge fare evasion spike is through the front door. And unless I'm wrong, there's a driver at the front door versus the rear doors. So do we know what's happening? How do people get past the driver and evade a fare as opposed to being, not having the right amount of money to pay for a fare, and maybe lets them off? They have less, they're short of quarters. I don't know, whatever it is. But how does, because when I look at this chart, the spike is really through the front door. The spike is not through the rear door. I was under an impression that we had a huge problem from the rear door with respect to fare evasion. Then when I look at this chart, it's the front door. So what's the explanation behind that?
So what I offer is that historically buses has always had a higher fare evasion rate than subways. I would say up into 2008, something happened in 2008. We lost and buried a bus operator for enforcing the fare. And we've seen a steady decline in fare enforcement or the request for the fare by our bus operators. I would also say that in 2012, in that period of time, we've seen a significant increase in assaults on bus operators. And what we've also saw was a correlative between assaults and the fare box and requesting the fare. So while we don't tell our bus operators not to request the fare, we don't encourage them to get involved because of the significant increase in assaults. And we've seen some, what I would say, some egregious attacks on bus operators, and primarily all related to enforcing the fare.
Well, let me just, I know Commissioner Schomburg wants to say something, but I assume, President Byford, that as part of your future ongoing efforts, I mean, one, as I know, maybe we did this in Albany, or maybe we're still talking about Albany. There should be increased criminal penalties for anybody who assaults anybody that's an MTA employee, number one. Number two is, I assume our drivers have some kind of form of communication, radio, something. I'm not here to encourage that our drivers get into confrontations or altercations, but maybe there's a way to work with the NYPD that when people just try to evade the fare and they refuse to adhere to the bus driver saying, no, you can't get on, that they can use the dispatch and get a radio car to come follow the bus, and when the bus goes to the next bus stop, they can get on the bus and either remove the person from the bus, arrest the person, write them a ticket, whatever, but just come up with a program to deal with that. Maybe there'll be fewer people that will try to evade the fare that way.
It's very good points, Chair. So, I mean, it was the exact same debate we had at the Toronto Transit Commission, because on the one hand, you don't want to put your staff unduly at risk by saying you must absolutely, to the point of trying to grab a fare out of someone's hand, you must engage with them, because I don't think any of us think that's a good idea. But having said that, what we're not saying is be passive to fare aggression. So the operators do have a fare dispute button, so that they can effectively notify that there has been fare evasion on their particular route. That enables us to build up a picture of what's happening on each route, where the fare evasion is happening, such that we can then put Eagle teams on board, whether they be plainclothes or whether they be uniformed, because we know that there's either generic fare evasion going on, or there is one particular individual who boards the bus every day and says, I'm not paying, it's a free service. So we certainly don't expect people to be, our people to be passive to that kind of thing. We also take the view that it's kind of unfair to the majority of people on that bus, maybe 50 people who have paid a fare, to have the bus just sit there in a standoff, an impasse, where probably because it's an impasse, the operator will get assaulted anyway, when those other people have paid a fare. So shouldn't we keep the line moving, but still call it in such that the cavalry can arrive? And that's exactly what we do.
I appreciate that. The only thing I'd ask you to look at is if there is a way, and look, I'm not trying to delay the ridership either, because I know it takes a long time as it is. But if there's a way where a bus driver can just somehow contact a radio car and that radio car come right away, I think when people who intentionally try to evade paying a fare, when they realize when they get on that bus, they're going to get a cop, an NYPD officer is going to come and take them and arrest them when they get off that bus. I think that's going to become a big deterrent to try it in the first place. If you wait till later on and just keep the data, or they're not threatened that they could to arrest, I think it's much less of a deterrent. So I just asked to look at.
No. So I do agree, and maybe I didn't convey that properly. We do try to get the bus met. So we do try to arrange for a welcoming committee to board the bus.
Great.
To deal with the person, the fare evader. Then it's not always possible, but there is a means of raising a concern, and people do use it.
Mr. Chairman, may I add a constructive footnote to that? And that is, if you will get together with Local 100, which is as opposed to fare evasion as anyone else, I'm sure they will work with you, and the bus drivers will work with you to stop and to use the best resources. But you are entirely correct, Mr. Eric, in pointing out that the attacks on bus drivers, like the attacks on other MTA workers, have severely demoralized them and made them quite scared, and with good cause.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, the last graph, and I apologize, it's a little noise with some zigzags around because we have quarterly data that bounces a bit. But let's start with the green line on the bottom. The green line is arrests by quarter on a daily basis. So you can see the arrests started declining really midway at the end of 15 and have declined steadily and more rapidly recently in terms of the number of arrests. The red line is summonses. So summonses similarly have declined and similarly had a more recent precipitous drop, with the exception of the last quarter, which is a very significant rebound from the Transit Bureau, and we're happy to see that and hope it continues, and perhaps it will feed back in behaviorally to the rates that we're seeing. But I will point out that even with that surge recently in summonses, we're still well below the overall historical levels. The black bold line at the top is overall enforcement action, so looking at summonses and arrests together. So even with the increase in summonses, it hasn't made up for the decline in arrests, and the summonses themselves have experienced a decline over the period significantly.
Chairman, may I?
Yeah, I should put this in context, since Cy-Vance's decision was in part based on some of our research. When I first came to this board in 2016 and heard that we had 130,000 stops and 30,000 arrests, 92% of whom were Black and Latino, this information was not presented to us, that you were keeping this since 2013. Then when I talked to Chief Fox, he tells me they only go where the crime is. And as we got from legal aid and other words, they were all Black and Latino communities. So clearly there's not correlation going on here between a system-wide problem and the over-enforcement in the poorest and blackest and Latino neighborhoods of the city of New York. That's why I started to press on this issue. If we'd been straight about this and heard about Staten Island and other places which are not considered the poorest parts of the city, maybe we would have had a more proactive effort and a sense of equity here, because it is not, at least traditionally, equitable enforcement. So I urge us, as we go through this, I want to see equity here. We have is this old ladies getting on the bus who are not considered violent criminals? Is this in Staten Island, where you have whole sections that are not being prosecuted? Is this drop because suddenly, not because only of Cy-Vance, there's a concern, and actually the data that we've gotten from NYPD shows that those neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of Blacks and Latinos are over-policed. And that's why I am concerned here. As we go to further enforcement, give me equity. I don't want people jumping turnstiles. I don't want people climbing on buses, but I want to make sure this is not race-based. And at least initially, it was. So I think that's part of the difficulty here, and certainly in my discussions with Cy-Vance, based on research that we had done using legal aid services, there was overwhelmingly concentration on the poorest, on the blackest and Latino, and on the young. So we've got to shift these dynamics to make it clear, yes, we're going to have enforcement, but it's going to be system-wide. Everyone is going to be treated equally and enforced equally, because that was the other thing. The arrests were overwhelmingly concentrated at essentially the youngest and people of color. So that's what started to lead the groundwork for some of my concern here when I first heard it in 2016. I'm now hearing that we did have some research that was showing otherwise, that there were other problems in the system, and that wasn't being meshed with the policing. So this is more, just put in context that hopefully the half-price fare move will help the lowest income people, and that's why I was asking on the weekends. If I'm a kid and I don't have any money for the weekend to go wherever to the park, yeah, the likelihood is, as I did as a kid, I'm going under because I don't have any money at this point. But if we can have something that can relieve the poorest individuals in society, particularly the young, give them an option for some discount, veterans, kids at CUNY and SUNY, then we can start to have, I think, something that ultimately brings our levels down more commensurate with other cities. So that's more a statement than something I wanted to get off my chest. I recognize that people wanted to blame Cy-Vance for this. I think the motivation for Vance's move was the inequity that was built into the system prior to ours taking a new look at this.
May I just comment? I feel I have to comment. No, I am not blaming any individual, and I hope the impression hasn't been given that we are. We're merely stating a fact that there is a correlation between that announcement being made, and I was reminded, actually, I believe the Bronx DA made a similar commitment. There is a correlation between that. If you look at that blue line jumping up in terms of daily fare evaders, and the decline, not exactly concurrent, but quite similar, on the black line of the enforcement action, there is a correlation between that declaration being made. So it's not a blame issue. It's merely just a statement of fact, because you want us to be, you want us to give you evidence-based reports, and that's just a fact. Second thing is, totally understand your point and agree with you, actually, on we've got to be careful that we don't unleash, just mass arrests on an unfair basis. We most certainly are not advocating that. Actually, it's, and I know you would agree with this, the assumption is it's always poor people. No, it isn't. We find from the police data, the police arrest data, and Bobby knows this better than me, quite often you find people who are pretty well off, who absolutely can afford the fare but choose not to for whatever reason, who when they're stopped are found to have plenty of money on their person and could easily have paid the fare but chose not to do so. I mean, the one thing I wanted to just to really try to give you some assurance on, notwithstanding your very valid concern, is that because we undertook that due diligence when we came together as a new team, and we did say to the police, you've got to do something about this. We have now seen that uptake in Q2 of 2018. But I'll certainly convey that back to Chief De La Torre, that this cannot be some kind of just blanket all-out onslaught against particular demographics.
Thank you.
First, let me correct one comment you inadvertently made, namely it wasn't the district attorney of the Bronx. Judge Clark has a very strongly held view on the subject. It was another district attorney. And if you look at the chart, the correlation between the blue line and the date of Cy Vance's announcement is quite dramatic. May I try and put to you a constructive approach again? Let me suggest the following. As I said earlier, one very useful thing would be, for at least a period of time, for the New York City Police Department to extend its transit bureau to the buses in addition to the subways. As Mr. Eric will tell you, that's a suggestion that's been on the table on my part for the better part of 7 years. So it's something that can happen. They are good people. They dropped the amount of summonses, as you can see from the chart, when the obvious demoralization came from a statement they won't be prosecuted. Why give a summons if nobody's going to prosecute on it? So let me make the following suggestions. One, bring New York City Police Department Transit Bureau to the buses. Two, enforce for those instances where there are recidivists. So, for example, if it's a first-time offender, discharged on his own recognizance, give him a second chance, maybe even a second and a third, but make it a policy to do it. If you do the crime, do the time. If you do it repeatedly, it's worth noting whatever you are. Number three, in the past, in the city's history, both the police department and the Corporation Counsel's office have handled kinds of prosecutions. For example, in the family court area, the Corporation Counsel has done that forever. In the police department area, they used to do it in the subways as well. On the 3rd Avenue L days, there are very few people here who are as vintage as I am and remember the 3rd Avenue L, which I rode, but the fact is they did. And my point is, if the district attorneys feel it is beneath their dignity to prosecute fare evasion effectively and continuously and wisely, have a prosecutor come from the MTA designated by them. There is the power to do that. It should be done. Number four, the courts are the principal culprit when we get to the end of the road. You can prosecute till you're green in the face, But unless you have a court that's willing to do something about it, where judges believe it's beneath their dignity, they ought to get off the bench. And they ought to be put in a position where they ought to do these kind of things. It seems to me that we have an opportunity to do something. David Jones is 1,000,000% correct. We were not told that there was the offsetting factors that are shown now. And I congratulate you, and I congratulate Tim Mulligan for finally pointing it out to us. But the fact is, it's time to act. And there is a way of acting. And we can do it unilaterally. We don't need state laws to do it. All we have to do is have, the simplest way, have the MTA designate a prosecutor, have them designated by the DAs as special assistant district attorneys, or by the Attorney General as special assistant attorneys general, which they designate all the time for election cases.
Thank you, Commissioner Merdler. Does any, okay.
Yes.
Commissioner Weisbrod.
Just a few thoughts.
Hopefully we can stick it to questions as opposed to.
Well, I guess a few things. One, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, because you've highlighted this issue, and I thank Tim and Andy for this data, which is extremely helpful. It occurs to me, and I still don't understand, given what everyone has said about the effectiveness of the Eagle teams, and I'm not questioning the decision to redeploy Eagle teams in a different way, but I am saying that given the massive fare evasion on the buses, I don't understand why we shouldn't be expanding the Eagle teams at this point, given more effective in view of management redeployment, rather than cutting Eagle teams. That's one question. And then two, this is an enormous amount of data, and it's really, really useful. But as Mr. Byford said, and we don't really have a full picture of who the fare evaders are, why they're doing it, and what we may well need different kinds of enforcement and sanctions for different kinds of evaders. And the goal here is not to be throwing however many 208,000 daily evaders into jail, but to end or sharply reduce fare evasion. And it may, as Mr. Merdler said, require a variety of approaches, some of them conceivably not criminal approaches in terms of sanctions. And so I would ask that all of those be explored. And just my final point on this is, this is, in addition to the revenue we are losing, this is sending such a terrible message to the vast majority of riders, many of them who really scrape together their fares, who pay their fares and watch people who don't. And I just think it's incumbent upon us to address this problem. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so just three quick responses. Fully agree, actually. I'll start with the last one first. It's exactly because it's just simply not right that the decent, fare-paying majority should witness other people getting away with it, that we have focused on this issue pretty much from the start of my tenure as a new team, and there's more to follow. In terms of why people evade fares, one thing that I've floated with my team, which I've seen done elsewhere, is to conduct an anonymous third-party comprehensive fare evasion survey, where you try to get to the bottom of why is it that you evade the fare. Is it because you can't afford it? Well, that's why it's good that we now have fair fares. Is it because normally you do, but on occasions you think, oh well, no one's looking, and the gate's open, I'll just sneak through. So it's not that you're inherently minded to evade the fare, but you're an opportunist. Is it because you fundamentally don't think you should pay? You're some sort of recidivist, it should be free? Is it because it's some kind of protest vote that the service isn't good enough, so why the hell should I pay for it? It's kind of the quid pro quo. You're not meeting your side of the bargain, so I won't meet mine. I think that can give you some really rich data as to what people's motivations are for fare evasion. So we are considering that. And then the top one, you ask about cutting the Eagle teams. I did mention earlier, but to be fair, I didn't reiterate it in summarizing. I'm very interested. I've asked Bobby to have a look at a business case, because if you're losing $215 million, but you could spend, let's just say, $20 million on X amount more teams who would more than cover their costs and bring in way more than their cost, because they either bring in summons revenue or more likely provide the deterrent that we need. I'm very interested in that. So I've got Bobby actively working up that business case and that elasticity right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think a lot has been said here. Commissioner Myrtla came up with his multi-pronged plan. One of it was a thing about judges being on the bench. I'll use that maybe not to be assigned to criminal court. At any rate, you know, it's interesting that the suggestions that came here, and I know several years ago we did have a problem on Staten Island on the buses. We had a serious fare evasion problem. That was, I don't know what it was, 8 years ago, I forgot. But there was a concerted effort to address that with the DA there, with us having teams go on. Now, I have a couple of questions about how we deal. I mean, what ultimately we want to do is make people pay the fare. We don't really want to arrest people for a number of reasons. One thing, it takes a cop off the street or off whatever they're doing for a period of time. The court system has to deal with it, whether they take it seriously or not. We'd rather have them pay the fare. So one of our strategies for years has been to give them tickets, and we give people, I think we give people 3 chances, is that correct, before we did an arrest? I think that was what it was, right? No?
I'm sorry, not with the Eagle team. What you're talking about is actually what occurred back in 2013. We saw
Yeah,
that
on Staten
fare evasion,
Island,
right?
yeah.
Staten Island was very, very high. We went out there, and I'll be honest with you, it was quite disturbing to actually see people get on the front door of a bus and just wave their hand and just walk on. You know, and there are other factors that are involved in, including SATOA, where you can ride the system for free. All right, so that kind of like all compiles in. What we did is that we believe in the way that we operate is to have behavior modification. It's not a point of just giving out summonses. We want people to pay the fare. That should be the mantra of anything with fare evasion. Because as someone stated before, it's probably about 3 to 4% of hardcore fare evaders that are not going to pay the fare no matter what. And then you do have your opportunists, as Andy said, who, if I walk in the door and Tim walks in the door, that third, fourth person is going to say, hey, I'm going to walk through the door also. So that's really what we try to alleviate. Okay, and that's what I think we.
Thank you for that. No, that's exactly
Right.
was my point. Is that you create a culture of people not paying the fare. I mean, there's one of the train system I've been on in the times up to, and Boston seems to have at different times on the Green Line in particular seems to have that kind of culture in different places. I don't want to say something that's not true, but that's been my observation. And I think we probably had that on Staten Island. Maybe we need to go back and try to do that again. But there's different strategies. I'm just saying what we do on the subway. My impression was we would give out the Transit Adjudication Bureau ticket, and after when we found someone had done that 3 times and not paid, we then would, if they were caught again, we'd arrest them. Wasn't that the way that was done? It was done now?
I'm not sure as far as the Transit Bureau what their procedures are, because
Okay.
I believe there comes a point where you become a transit recidivist.
Right.
If you've been issued a couple of summonses, and then you can actually be put into the system. It's almost like
Even if you've paid the fines?
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
On that. To be honest with you, I'm not sure.
No, it'd be interesting if it's that clear, because we don't, in this escalated thing, what we don't want to do is arrest people unless we absolutely have to. And as you point out, it's only 3 or 4%. We want to get people to pay the fare, and it'd be interesting to hear what other systems are doing that are doing better than us. I mean, I assume we have a relationship. We still belong to APTA, don't we? Yeah. Okay. We must have a relationship with this, and what they do, and are we learning from them? Because some systems have a lower fare evasion than we do, and I understand they don't really want people to know. But, are we learning from them? And what do they do? Is really what my question is.
Just one reaction, because I didn't make this point earlier. One thing that will, of course, help us is when we move to a universal new fare payment method, namely a smart card, we will have a proof of payment system. So that then, in the scenario that we talked about earlier, if you snuck onto the bus and then someone says, I don't think you paid for your fare, you say, I did actually, I dropped it in, I dropped some money in. Well, going forward, I mean, particularly if, and it's a very big if we move to cashless and we said you must now use a smart card, debit card, credit card, phone, but you had a genuine proof of payment a regime, wherever you are in the system, whether you're on a bus or whether you're somewhere on the subway, you must be prepared to present on demand proof of payment. So therefore, if you haven't either paid in the first place or you haven't paid enough, that will be immediately apparent to a fare inspector, and that's the system that we want to move to.
We have to be aware of the way we treat Easy Pass or people who cross our tolls, bridges and tunnels who don't pay, and how we treat people who go and ride our transit system without paying. There's been a perceived, and maybe it's actually true, difference between the way we treat these people, because we don't go arresting people, and then there's probably good reason for that, because you can find out what vehicle they have and you could handle it that way, we hope, but if the person's out of state, we can't. So the question, becomes, I think we have to show kind of equal treatment there. If we're going to start arresting people who fare evaded on our transit system, then we're going to have to start to look at people who are recidivists and not paying tolls and going after them in a similar way.
Okay. Commissioner Jones?
Yeah, just a couple of comments and questions. One, in the preliminary data I got from the NYPD, the arrest rate in Staten Island is virtually nil. So I want to just, I'm sorry, I go over the board on this. There's a differential here that's so obvious, particularly since the spike in Staten Island exists. Also, is my understanding, and I think we asked this earlier, about how many people actually come, get their tab summons, and come in to pay. And it's been a question we've been talking, at least anecdotally, to people. I couldn't pay the $275. Where am I to come up with over $100? And I think we have to recognize that because of different economic levels going on here, what seems like a particular, oh, sure, I'll come up with $125 or whatever it is, and take a day off from work or whatever. I don't see why you should complain about it. It becomes virtually impossible for a low-wage worker. So I think we just have to, and I think it goes to starting to deconstruct what's going on here and make it, a sense, more equitable. Also, and I just want to reconfirm, you were the one who mentioned, Tim, that in our half-price fare campaign that the city now has agreed to, that the city told me that you could only do, the MTA said it could only do 7-day and 30-day passes. You said at an earlier meeting, no, that wasn't true. This is what the city told us to do.
The city chose the product they wanted for that program.
Okay,
we're having subsequent discussions with them about, perhaps a change of heart in terms of what their decision is, but we made all of our regular products to our regular customers available to them.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Before we close, just a couple of questions or suggestions from me. I know you always enjoy them. One is I would just say to the Phil, Kathy, and Andy, I think it would, this was, I think, very helpful, very informative. I think going forward, though, what would be very useful to the members of the Finance Committee and probably all the members of the board is we need to set a new goal of where we want to be. We're not going to eliminate fare evasion. I get it. But it should, each one of the agencies should come up with a goal and when you expect to hit that goal in 2019, one. Two is I think we should start comstatting this and get a monthly report that you can share with the board. And maybe it's a comparison, since there seemed to have been a big spike right around 15, 16 to 18. So maybe use 15, 16 as a baseline to compare month over month where you are. But we need to enforce this across the entire MTA region, not specific regions. And for the presidents of the commuter rails. I'm a daily rider of Metro North. I've seen plenty of times when the trains are very crowded, I don't even see a conductor go through the train. So whether it's adding conductors or enforcing that they go through and check everyone's ticket, I'm sure it's different for New York City than it is for Long Island, than it is for the Hudson Valley. But whatever the problem is or issues are, we need to do a better job of enforcing it. But I'm not here to micromanage how you figure out what the solution is. The other thing is, at some point, if DAs don't want to prosecute and cops aren't going to write tickets because the DAs won't prosecute or the courts don't want to hear this, then we got to come up with another solution, because it can't be just throw your hands up. Maybe we have to look at maybe creating an MTA court, and maybe you go to MTA court, and the MTA court with a specialty there, and the money goes to the MTA, right? So there's always a solution to a problem, and the solution is there is no solution to the problem. I don't think we're there yet. And the last thing is, and I'm asking Bob, head will probably explode, but I'll take my chances. I've been a little unhappy on the process, the way we've been moving forward with a future fare hike for our ridership. And irrespective of my comments at the last board meeting, the press writes that there are 2 fare hike plans. I still take the position that there's not 2 fare hike plans. There's any fare hike plan that the board chooses to approve or disapprove. And one of the things I want to look at right now is tying any future fare hike to improvements in reducing fare evasion. And I think one of the things might be, since we always look for a biannual or a 2-year fare and hike increase, is that somehow either legislatively, legally, I don't know how you do this, but you guys can think about it and figure it out because you're all smart people, is I want to tie whether or not a second, if we do any kind of fare hike, but a second year of the 2-year fare hike is somehow tied to some goals and objectives on reducing fare evasion. Because again, I just think it's unfair to ask riders to pay more when there are people here that are trying to evade the system. I don't know all the reasons for fare evasion, but the whole world knows you're supposed to pay to get on a New York City subway or a New York City bus. So people are intentionally, for whatever reason, breaking the law, and that's just not acceptable. And I feel strongly that we need to send a very loud and clear message to the ridership that, yeah, we may need you to pay more, but in exchange for paying more, we are going to improve the reliability of the system. We are going to improve the performance of the system, but we're going to crack down on the people that have somehow been scamming the system and getting away with not paying. So somehow I want to tie that puts pressure on ourselves as an entity, that if we don't hit certain benchmarks, milestones, goals, and objectives, that the second year of any potential fare increase, whether it's 1%, 2%, or some other number, doesn't go into effect. We need to hold our feet to the fire. We need to hold ourselves accountable. Not everyone may agree with that kind of strategy here, but it's something that I'm asking as chair of the Finance Committee, we take a look at it, because to sit here and know that $200 million, could be $300 million, is somehow, not being collected. When we talk about huge cost drivers, huge revenue losers, losses, that's huge. And even if we could cut it in half, $100 million could go a long way to even either cleaning up stations, improving reliability, or holding down future fare increases. So I'd ask that, Bob, your team take a look at that so we can have a discussion before we have to take a vote on any future fare hike. Okay? If we don't have any more questions, I appreciate everyone's time in putting together this presentation, and we'll reconvene. Do I need a motion?
One quick, all the materials that were presented today are available on our website, so if you need to share them or want to review them, please go there. So need a motion.
I need a motion to adjourn. Second. All those in favor, thank you.